Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to the Atlantic Council and the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. My name is Fred Hoff. I'm the director of the Rafiq Hariri Center. Delighted you're all here today. Sorry for the late start. I really do like to start things on time, but we had a constant flow of folks coming in, and I'm delighted with the crowd today. What we're gonna do today is something a little bit different from what we've customarily done in our Syria programs here at the Council over the past 3.5 years. Normally, and I think it generally reflects best practices, is when you have a program like this, you try to focus laser-like on one subject, one theme. We're not gonna do that today, mainly because, well, entirely because we have a very distinguished group of women Syrian opposition leaders today who are focusing with great expertise on different aspects of the problem. You've got all the bios. I'm not going to go into a detailed recitation, but we've got Dr. Basma Kodmani, who has really been at the heart of the political opposition from the beginning of the Syrian revolution. In her most recent incarnation, she's been serving as a spokesperson for the High Negotiating Committee in Geneva. We have Ms. Alize Mofrej, who is also a member of the High Negotiations Committee. And what Alize brings to the table today is real, detailed expertise about an aspect of the Syria problem that is often overlooked and should not be overlooked. It's the problem of detainees. And it's one of these hidden issues. Number one, it should not be hidden. But the fact is that if we ever get any kind of traction at all toward a political settlement in Syria, this particular issue will come front and center. So it's better, I think, that we should know about it now. And we have Dr. Seve Aydın Izuli, who is Paris-based, who is one of the leading experts in the world about the Kurdish situation in Syria. So on the one hand, I apologize for the fact that we're not tightly focused on one theme, but I think we will be able to cover the waterfront of some really interesting issues today. I would invite all to join the conversation, to submit questions on Twitter. In English, we're talking about at AC Mideast, in Arabic, at Syria Source, and the hashtag is AC Syria. What we're going to do, in the interest of time, we've got this place until 1:30. If we use up all the time, that's great. I'm going to close it down at 1:30. If we exhaust all the questions before that, I'm not the least bit shy about letting everybody go early. But what we're going to do is dispense with anything that resembles an opening statement, beyond what I've just said. We're going to get directly into a conversation up here. And then in the fullness of time, I'm gonna turn it over to you for questions. And I'd like to start with Basma Kodmani, if I may. And let's start perhaps with the news of the day. There are reports, accurate reports, I think, that Secretary of State John Kerry in Moscow is going to do his best to sign the Russians up to some kind of an agreement, some kind of an arrangement. Presumably, one, that under the best possible terms and with the best possible execution would oblige the Russians to focus on actual terrorist targets in Syria, perhaps ground the Syrian government air force for the sake of civilian protection, and perhaps involve the accelerated movement of humanitarian assistance in Syria. That's number one. There are also reports of, I think it's an MSNBC interview of Bashar al-Assad, where he is appearing quite triumphant and confident. But my opening question centers on the possibility of a U.S.-Russian agreement. What is your sense of what can be achieved? What are the dangers? How would you recommend proceeding?
Thank you, Fred. Thank you for organizing this event. The Atlantic Council is a friendly place for us, and we come with pleasure. And every time we have the opportunity, we are very grateful for it. So this gathering is very much appreciated by us. And what makes maybe the common theme, or the one theme for this event, despite our differences, is women's participation in the politics of Syria. And I think this is a struggle within the struggle, and we lead it. Some of my friends and other Syrian women are sitting here, and they lead this fight every day. It's a long-term struggle for us. So that's also, that is one aspect and a key aspect of why we are together here today as Syrian women. To answer your question, I think the news is bringing important developments, which we read with hope and concern at the same time. The hope is there may be serious cooperation at the highest level to finally address the Syrian situation in a serious way, and at the level that is required. And that the two key players, those who can make a difference, are the United States and Russia. We don't buy the discourse that says it has to be a Syrian solution. That is simply a way of putting things that doesn't help, because we know how many players are there on the ground and who is able to direct all of these players in some direction for the process to become controllable and therefore manageable and move towards a solution. Our concern here is what has been throughout the concern of the Syrian opposition. Is this cooperation leading to serious commitment by those key players? Is the United States with Russia agreeing on serious measures to ensure that the regime will comply? And I say the regime not because I am opposition, because if you look at on the ground, you see that the opposition has all along come along and cooperated with the international community and has been faced with no compliance from the regime. The latest being, end of February, we committed, the groups on the ground committed, political opposition committed, and military groups on the ground committed to a cessation of hostilities. And that cessation of hostilities was then violated. Humanitarian aid should have gone in. This is a resolution of the Security Council. Is it going in? The answer is no. We have to negotiate every convoy. So in fact, it is who is going to implement what is agreed. And this discussion and this plan to cooperate on targeting terrorist groups on the ground, the source of concern is not targeting terrorist groups. The opposition is not uncomfortable with that. It is uncomfortable with the lack of compliance that we have seen all along. If that pattern is maintained, so our question is, what is needed for that pattern not to continue and for compliance to take place? And therefore, if the international players are asking the opposition to commit to anything this time, what is the opposition getting in terms of compliance on the other side? What are the guarantees? And I think this is the question that hangs over this agreement.
Well, let me pursue that a bit. The question of compliance, the question of what happens if an agreement is reached, at least in principle, some kind of implementation starts, and we begin to experience the usual pattern of a sort of rolling double cross. Okay, I think this was an issue addressed by the 51 State Department officials in their dissent memorandum. They recommended a specific kinetic fix to this. In your sense, when you think about compliance, when you think about obliging the opposition to sign up with the United States in a particular initiative, what comes to your mind in terms of tools for compliance?
I think it's mainly it's a commitment to and to formulate now, to define what consequences the regime would face if it were to barrel bomb a market as it did just last night. It bombed another, it threw barrel bombs on 2 markets in Syria, killing civilians. And so it really is all about how that would be, and it's enforcing a cessation of hostilities. If the cessation of hostilities doesn't have any teeth to it, we're not going to find it credible. The groups on the ground will continue to organize themselves in a way to be prepared for the next round of fighting, and it won't achieve anything. And if the objective is really to marginalize the radical groups, to focus on them and to target them, I think there's no hope that that can happen. What you want from cessation of hostilities is that it triggers certain positive dynamics, a certain virtuous circle that marginalizes the radical groups because their value is in their fighting capacity. No fighting, their capacity immediately diminishes and their value diminishes. Now, it sounds idealistic, but the reality is you can start working. It's a complex process. It will take time. But if that line that separates the regime forces from the opposition forces is not a credible line, nothing will happen to clean up this country from terrorist groups and spoilers. And so the political agreement will have no value.
Well, let's focus on that a little bit, and particularly on the Nusra front. I think it's been the sense of many of us as this fight has unfolded over the past few years. The Nusra front presents a series of dilemmas, does it not? Both operational and analytical. On the one hand, it's managed to put together a group of fighters who, in relative terms, have been pretty effective in concentrating against the Assad regime. On the other hand, it's, at least in terms of leadership, it's clearly an affiliate of al-Qaeda. How does the mainstream Syrian opposition deal with this dilemma? How would you like to, ideally, how would you deal with it?
I believe what we call the Free Syrian Army are the groups we identify as the ones who are embedded in the local social environment, and the groups who have shown that they will be part of a negotiated settlement when they complied with the cessation of hostilities at the end of February. That message, that compliance has not been built on, has not been used to say, maybe the defining line is those who comply and those who do not comply, as a first criterion to vet the groups, if you like. Then we can move to a more sophisticated definition of who should be part of the future of Syria. Clearly, groups who are calling for an Islamic imara, what we call an Islamic state or Islamic caliphate, or none of these groups fit in what has been defined in Geneva. And so groups will have to start making choices. And groups, as you know, came together because of money and arms and sometimes ideology. So if they're hardcore ideologists, they will remain Al-Qaeda. But they'll have to go somewhere else or be targeted. But the rest will be the ones looking at what is the future for us? How do we survive in this country? Are we Syrian? Are we part of this society? All of these questions will never come up unless we have a credible cessation of hostilities that leads to a ceasefire. Nusra, to answer your question, Nusra has attacked some of the moderate groups, has evicted them from certain areas, has taken over, has threatened, has kidnapped, has killed many of the leaders of a Free Syrian Army. These are not good allies. In the fight, they fight the regime. But that doesn't tell us that that the Free Syrian Army wants them around.
That's very clear. The High Negotiations Committee, and this will be my final, Basma. The High Negotiations Committee obviously was formed to organize, both in terms of personnel and agenda, to negotiate at Geneva. 2 days ago, I believe, the foreign minister of the Russian Federation strongly attacked the UN Special Envoy, Stefan de Mistura, for not having reconvened negotiations in Geneva. Do you think he was justified in that attack?
Stefan de Mistura has been in the beginning, was distrusted by the opposition because he seemed to be too much focused on gaining the trust of the Russians and the Iranians. And so visits to Tehran, visits to Moscow, statements that seemed to suggest that the opposition had more concessions to make and more to prove than the regime does, that made the opposition very uncomfortable, really. And he was making suggestions that seemed really irrelevant for the situation on the ground. Over time, and particularly since the Geneva process started in January of this year, he has moved to work with the two parties. He has been meeting as much with the regime as he has with the opposition, and I think he has come to realize himself that one party was cooperating and the other wasn't. Now, for him to succeed, he needs some guarantees. He knows that Geneva is only a stage for what is happening elsewhere, and that the pressure points are in Moscow and Washington. And frankly, in Moscow, much more than Washington at the moment. So he wants to see that something is given to him to make his mission possible, because he cannot afford to have a fourth round or a third round that is where the opposition withdraws. We've only had one round of negotiations where the opposition remained and left on time as planned. The other two sessions were interrupted by massive airstrikes by Russia and the regime. And so if he faces something like this, it could be the end of the Geneva process. And I think he is being very wise in trying to get something before we go back to Geneva. It's better not to go back now, wait until we have something. And that's something, if the agreement between Russians and Americans to work together is connected to the political process, because that's what we want. And that document seems to say there will be also a political arrangement as part of that cooperation. Frankly, that's where we are very wary of what has been cooked without consulting with us. So it's a moment where we're not seeing through everything. We're seeing the risk of a bad agreement. And honestly, the opposition is saying this administration has not helped us, has not made us a partner. Although we have made all the concessions, we have united, we have controlled the armed groups, they have complied and so on, all of this is not producing guarantees from the American side. That it doesn't give the administration now the right to lower our ceiling and to tell us, you must live with Assad. The agreement will look like this, and these are the terms, and if you don't like them, that is not your choice. Mm-hmm. I think we'd rather see commitment on cessation of hostilities. That is an accessible objective, we believe, if there is the will to enforce it, rather than, and if there is no political agreement that is satisfactory with which we can live, it's better not to have an agreement, frankly, right now, and let a better context produce that agreement later.
Permit me to welch on my commitment to take you off the hot seat here, but there is one other thing that arises from your comments. A lot of commentary these days about U.S.-Russia, constant refrain, U.S.-Russia. Where does Iran fit in with all of this? Why is it not U.S.-Russia-Iran?
Yes, it should be U.S.-Russia and then Iran and Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, the players on the ground. Iran has chosen not to be active or hardly visible in the diplomatic game. So although it is part of the International Syria Support Group, the 17-country group, it apparently remains completely silent in those fora. It is present on the ground, and clearly those sitting in meetings in Vienna or elsewhere or Geneva are not the same as those who are deploying the strategy on the ground. Iran remains with its agenda of a sectarian agenda, militias there, fighting against all the groups on the ground, developing an agenda of extending its presence, property, acquiring property, and etc. Things that are, and perhaps rooting militias of a sectarian nature, such as it has done in Lebanon and it has done in Iraq. So, and Iran knows very well that all of this is unacceptable by any international criteria. So it prefers to stay very silent at the moment. There will come a moment when, if there is something to be implemented, Iran will become the spoiler. And at that moment, we will have to see whether Russia says, we have reached something and therefore you, Iran, have to go along with this. And that relationship will, I think, become clearer to us at that moment. For the moment, there's a potential difference between the two. They need each other because ground troops are ensured by Iran on the ground. But the moment there is an agreement, I think we might see some differences, hopefully, between Iran and Russia. The objectives are clearly very different.
Good. We'll return to this, I'm sure, during the question period. Let's move on to this very distressing issue of detainees. Elise, you are actually a graduate of the detention program in Syria. And you know as well as anyone that the taking of detainees without legal due process has been a practice of the Assad regime long before 2011, long before all of this violence started. But it is now reportedly of such a scale that the UN Human Rights Council has accused the Assad regime of practicing, quote, extermination, unquote, in its detention facilities. I wonder if you could just briefly open this discussion by describing for us as briefly as possible the nature of the problem and its dimensions.
تحياتي للجميع. حقيقة المشكلة هي موجودة بالتقارير المنظمات الدولية من مجلس صادرة عن مجلس الأمن، الصادرة عن مجلس حقوق الإنسان، عن الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، لجنة تقصي الحقائق، وثقت بالفعل بأن ما يحدث في سوريا هي جرائم حرب وهي موضوعة إبادة جماعية، حيث تحولت المعتقلات في سوريا إلى أماكن لتصفية المعتقلين وليس لاحتجازهم.
So the problem of detainees, can everyone hear me? Okay. So the problem of detainees has been described in several reports. We've seen resolutions by the UN Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and reports by the UN Secretary General, as well as reports by the Commission of Inquiry that said that the crimes being committed inside detention centers amount to war crimes and collective extermination. So the case now is that we have a situation where detention centers are settings for killing detainees rather than simply detaining them.
هو أسلوب اعتمده النظام السوري من أيام حافظ الأسد لترويع المجتمع السوري ولقمعه ولإرهابه وخاصة للمعارضة السياسية من اليسار إلى اليمين، واستمر هذا النهج ولكن بأسلوب تعسفي، حيث جميع حالات الاختفاء أو الاعتقال التعسفي في سوريا بنسبة 80% تحولت إلى حالات من الاختفاء القسري. النظام غير معني أبداً ويعنيه تماماً ألا يكون هناك أي تقدم في موضوع المفاوضات والعمل بالعملية السياسية من أجل إنجاز هذا الملف، لأن فيه كثير من الفضائح ما يعيق مسيرة التعطيل التي ينتهجها في جنيف.
So this practice has been used since Hafiz al-Assad's time, and it's been a practice used to terrorize and subjugate the Syrian people, particularly members of the Syrian opposition from the right to the left. In fact, in most detention cases, 80% of detention cases became cases of forced disappearances. And the regime itself doesn't want any progress on political process because that would involve or entail progress on the detainee track, and that would reveal a lot about its horrific practices inside detention centers.
حقيقة لا نعتبرها أنها ملف، هي قضية لأنها قضية السوريين. عندما نتحدث عن 200 ألف معتقل وهو رقم تقريبي، إذا نتحدث عن كارثة بشرية. عندما نتحدث نحن عن وفاة تحت التعذيب ل 160 طفل هم أخذوا رهائن بسبب عوائلهم، هذا يعني انتهاك فاضح. قضية المعتقلين للأسف هي الجانب المخفي في العملية السياسية، لم يستعد النظام لفتحه أبداً، وخاصة أننا قدمنا الكثير من الآليات من أجل إنجاز هذا الملف. قلنا بأنه يحق بأن يكون لنا غرفة تاسك فورس شبيهة بعملية الهدنة والمساعدات الإنسانية، للأسف اصطدمت بالفيتو الروسي.
We don't consider the detainee file simply a file. It's an issue much bigger than that. We have an estimated over 200,000 detainees. So really it's become a humanitarian tragedy. We have 160 children killed under torture inside detention facilities. So the detainee issue is a hidden issue and the regime tries to cover it up and won't discuss it. We've tried with several initiatives to achieve progress on this track, including starting with the establishment of a task force similar to the one we have on humanitarian issues and the cessation of hostilities, but it's been met or blocked by a Russian veto.
تحدث القرار 2254 عن فصل المسار السياسي عن الإنساني، ولكن حقيقة هما متلازمان من أجل خلق بيئة تفاوضية صحية. من جانبنا، بما أننا متشاركون كقوى سياسية مدنية مع الفصائل العسكرية، أيضا قدمنا آليات. نحن نعرف ما لنا وما علينا. قدمت الفصائل العسكرية العديد من المبادرات من أجل إجراء تبادل الأسرى بشرط الإفراج عن النساء والأطفال كإجراء بناء ثقة. طبعا النظام رفض بالمطلق واعتبر بأن من يقدمون هذه المبادرات هم منظمات إرهابية لا يريد التفاوض معهم. طبعا علينا أن نذكر بأن العدد الموجود لدى الفصائل العسكرية لا يقارن بمئات الآلاف الموجودة لدى النظام السوري، ولم يتجاوز بالأصل العتبة حسب القانون الإنساني الدولي من باب التوضيح.
UN Security Council Resolution 2254 speaks about the separation of the humanitarian track and the political track, but in reality, both are needed to run in parallel to create a healthy negotiating environment. We have done what we can. We've worked with armed groups on the ground and proposed initiatives for prisoner exchanges, starting with the release of women and children as a confidence-building measure. But of course, the regime has refused that, claiming that the initiators of those initiatives are terrorist organizations that the regime refuses to negotiate with. And it's worth noting that the number of detainees or prisoners held by the armed groups doesn't compare to the scale and number of detainees detained by the regime.
في ظل إعاقة روسيا لوصول الملف السوري إلى محكمة الجنايات الدولية، طالبنا بالضغط للمجتمع الدولي من أجل إنشاء محكمة جرائم حرب لمحاسبة جميع مرتكبي جرائم الحرب في سوريا، لأن شرط المساءلة هي جزء من الحل السياسي التفاوضي وصولاً لتسوية سياسية تضمن السلام المستدام في سوريا. مسألة المحاسبة هي لا تمنح العدالة لضحايا النظام السوري فقط، ولكنها تمنع الارتكاب المزيد من الجرائم في سوريا. حتى الآن للأسف لم يطبق هذا الإجراء وهذه الآلية التي طالبنا فيها. أيضاً حاولنا الضغط من أجل استصدار قرار من مجلس الأمن، استصدار قرار تحت الفصل السابع، بما يعني وصول من المراقبين الدوليين المستقلين إلى أماكن الاحتجاز في سوريا، وتحديداً على رأسها الصليب الدولي، دون موافقة النظام من أجل الدخول إلى أماكن الاحتجاز. لدينا نحن مقرات الأسد الرسمية، ولدينا المقرات الرسمية التابعة لميليشيات حزب الله، من أجل الإشراف المباشر على الإفراج عن المعتقلين كإجراء بادر الثقة، وأيضاً لم نحصل على نتيجة. أيضاً طالبنا بشكل خاص فتح محاولة تطبيق الولاية القضائية العالمية المحلية، خاصة للاجئين الذين يهربون من أزلام النظام إلى أوروبا أو ممن يمرون بهذه الأراضي، من أجل تحقيق العدالة الانتقالية للحد من ارتكاب هذه الجرائم، كون المساءلة هي الأرضية التي تمنح التعايش المشترك بين السوريين، كي لا يكون هناك انفلات أمني إن حصل تقدم بالموضوع الانتقال السياسي.
In light of the Russian veto on a referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court, we have pushed for the establishment of a special war crimes tribunal that would try perpetrators of war crimes in Syria. For us, accountability is paramount and crucial to a political solution that achieves sustainable peace in Syria. This will not only guarantee justice for victims of the regime and the Syrian crisis, but will also prevent similar crimes from being committed in the future. We have also pushed for a UN Security Council resolution under Chapter 7 that would allow independent monitors access to detention facilities, specifically the ICRC, without regime permission. So this would allow independent monitors access to detention facilities, and we have formal detention facilities operated by Assad, but also branches operated by militias such as Hezbollah. And we're pushing for this to secure the release of detainees, but we haven't gotten any traction on that. We've also been pushing for more prosecutions under universal and national jurisdictions for those who have fled Syria and are now passing through Europe in order to limit such crimes from being committed in the future. And this is all important for civil peace and a sustainable peace in Syria in the future.
Elise, thank you. Thank you very much. That definitely does sketch out the dimensions of the problem. You were quoted recently as saying, quote, "The international community has failed to implement its legal and ethical obligations and force the regime to respect UN resolutions," unquote. You've mentioned some of the specifics you're looking for from the international community. I noted in the same article that the UN Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura, appointed a person named Eva Svoboda, formerly of the International Committee of the Red Cross, to oversee this issue in the humanitarian task force. And I'm just curious if you've had an opportunity to speak with Ms. Svoboda, and whether or not you're seeing any possibilities of progress through this working group.
نعم، السيدة إيفا سوفودا المنسقة الدولية وهي امرأة متنفذة وقوية استلمت هذا الملف، ولكن العلاقة بها محصورة لأنها لا تستطيع التواصل إلا عن طريق الأمم المتحدة، وخصوصا بعد التعليق في الجولة الثالثة لم نتواجد في جنيف حتى نتواصل. هي تقوم بالتنسيق مع الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية ومع روسيا عن طريق الأمم المتحدة، ونحن مستعدون أيضا لتقديم استراتيجيتنا التفاوضية بما يخص هذا الملف للتواصل معها مباشرة، وأظن أن اللقاء سوف يكون قريب وإن لم تستأنف المفاوضات، لأن العمل يجب أن يبقى مستمرا للضغط من أجل القضايا الإنسانية التي هي الأساس في العملية السياسية التي تمنح تقدم فيها وإنجاز. موضوع قضية المعتقلين هو ما يمنح المصداقية للشعب السوري ويعطيهم ثقة وأمل بأن هذه العملية تعنيهم بالذات. تعودنا على المجتمع الدولي أن يتحدث باسمنا، أن يصيغ القرارات دون إذننا، ولكن لا يمكن إلا أن نشارك بوضع الأسس التي تبني سوريا الديمقراطية انطلاقا من ثوابتنا. غالبية المعتقلين هم أصحاب مشروع تغييري ديمقراطي قام النظام باعتقالهم والكل يعرف، لكن المشكلة أن جميع من هم في داخل المعتقلات هم متهمون بدعم الإرهاب، وأنا واحدة من اليساريين من الأقليات وهو يدعي بأنه يحمي هذه الأقليات من الديمقراطيين الذي اتهمني بدعم الإرهاب. على ما أظن أن المجتمع الدولي يجب أن يكون أمام استحقاق في هذا الموضوع.
Let's try to give our interpreter a fighting chance here.
Yes, certainly Eva Svoboda has been appointed and to lead on this file. She's a very strong woman. She's working through the UN, so there's been limited contact because of that, particularly after our suspension of our participation in the last round of Geneva talks, and she's been coordinating with the United States and Russia through the United Nations on this issue. We are happy and we expect a meeting in the near future with her, and we're happy to share our negotiation strategy specific to the detainee issue. So even if there are no talks happening in Geneva, then there always needs to be some traction and some progress or some engagement on humanitarian issues. This gives credibility to the political process, but also gives Syrians faith and hope in the political process and what it might achieve. We are used to the international community speaking on behalf of Syrians or for Syrians, but we must play a part in solidifying and putting down the bases of our future Syria. Most detainees are part of the democratic change project, but unfortunately they've been accused of terrorism. I myself, a leftist and a minority, was detained by the regime despite its claim that it is protecting these minorities. So this is something the international community needs to be working on very heavily.
Terrific, thank you. Let's hear it for the interpreter. Often the forgotten person in proceedings like this. Thank you, Elise. And I hope this is a subject we'll return to in the question period. I know there are people in this room who know an awful lot about the detainee issue in Syria. For those of you who don't know a lot about it, but who are interested in Syria and the prospects for political settlement, I would urge you to pay some attention to this, because this really is the elephant in the room. When we get down to cases on political statement, on political settlement in Syria, this issue, which has been largely hidden from the public view, in my opinion, will loom larger than any other. So let's move on to a non-controversial subject, namely the Kurds of Syria. And since this is a very neutral and non-controversial subject, I'll start off in that spirit. Dr. Seve, could you give us your sense of where the YPG, PYD actually fit in the context of the Syrian revolution? Is it part of the Syrian revolution? Is it a problem for the Syrian revolution? What is your sense of this?
سيد أنت صعبت لي السؤال يعني.
My job.
أنا لا أريد أتكلم عن البويدي بشكل مخصص، وإنما لنتكلم في البداية عن مشاركة الكرد السوريون في الثورة السورية بشكل عام.
You've made the question very hard for me. I don't want to talk about the PYD specifically or any particular group. Let's start by talking about Syrian Kurds' participation in the Syrian revolution.
عشية انطلاق الثورة السورية نستطيع أن نقول بأن الكرد كانوا شبه القوة الوحيدة المنظمة في أحزاب سياسية على الساحة السورية.
On the eve of the revolution, I think it's safe to say that Kurds were the only organized groups on the Syrian scene.
فحاول النظام منذ البداية في مناورة سياسية حرف الكرد عن المشاركة بصورة كبيرة في الثورة السورية.
So the regime has tried from the beginning through a political maneuver to deviate Kurds from participating in the or being active in the Syrian revolution.
يعني تصوروا أن في سوريا يوجد 450 ألف كردي محرومين من الجنسية السورية، وهذا قانون الاستثناء من الجنسية السورية والحرمانهم موجود منذ سنة 1960 و62 منذ قدوم حزب البعث إلى السلطة. وكان هذا أحد المطالب الأساسية للأكراد السوريون باستعادة جنسيتهم السورية، ولكن النظام في أي لحظة من اللحظات لم يوافق على هذا المطلب. انطلقت الثورة السورية في 15 آذار 2011، وفي 7 نيسان 2011 كمعجزة أصدر بشار الأسد مرسوم تشريعي بإعادة الجنسية إلى السوريين. يعني هذا المطلب منذ 1960 ما حدا رد عليه، ومجرد ما طلعت الثورة السورية خلال 20 يوم كان انتهى الموضوع.
Imagine we have 450,000 Syrian Kurds deprived of Syrian citizenship, and this exclusion from Syrian citizenship has been in place since 1960, since 1962, with the rule of the Ba'ath Party, and this has been the demand for citizenship has been a demand from the beginning for Kurds. But of course the regime has not agreed to this. So the revolution started on March 15th, 2011. Lo and behold, a miracle happened, and 20 days later, the regime gave citizenship to these people. So imagine they were deprived of citizenship for decades, and then all of a sudden, Kurds were given citizenship.
فالنظام اعتقد بأنه بمنح الجنسيات سيحاول هو أنه حرف الأكراد. طبعا هذه لم تكن هدية من النظام، وإنما هي حق طبيعي من حقوق الأكراد. هم مواطنون سوريون أصليون وهم معنيون في النضال وفيما يحصل في سوريا. فاستمر الكرد في المشاركة في الثورة بشكل كبير، ولكن وللأسف يعني بعد انطلاق الثورة حصلت بعض المشاكل على الساحة السورية في المعارضة السورية. فالمشهد الكردي يعني في المناطق الكردية أصبح لدينا قوتين أساسيتين: المجلس الوطني الكردي وهو جزء من الائتلاف السوري، وحزب الاتحاد الديمقراطي بقي خارج هذا النطاق في التحالف مع المعارضة السورية. كان في بالتأكيد في هيئة التنسيق السورية يعني كما هو المشهد في المعارضة السورية يعني في جبهتين أو فصيلين مختلفين، الأكراد أيضا كانوا في فصيلين يعني موجودين على الساحة السورية.
So the regime thought by giving citizenship they could distract Kurds or deviate them from participating in the revolution. Of course, this wasn't a gift from the regime. This is a natural right for Syrian Kurds. They are citizens of Syria and are concerned with what goes on in Syria. So from the beginning of the revolution, Kurds have participated in the revolution, but differences did arise, especially with the opposition. And right now on the ground in Kurdish areas, we have two main forces, the YPG and the National Kurdish Council, and we also have the who work with the opposition or
الديمقراطي مع هيئة التنسيق مع هيئة التنسيق والتنين مع الائتلاف. للإجابة مباشرة على سؤالك، أنا شخصيا أعتقد بالتأكيد بأن حزب الاتحاد الديمقراطي هو جزء من المعارضة للنظام، وهو ليس مع النظام ولا يمكن أن يكون مع النظام، لأن هذا النظام أفلس في سياسته تجاه الشعب الكردي، وهو لن يستطيع في أي لحظة من اللحظات أن يعطي للكرد الحقوق المشروعة المطالب بها. يعني هو لا يمكن أن يؤمن بعدالة المطالب الكردية.
So to answer your question, I personally believe that these Kurdish groups are part of the opposition to the regime. They can never be allied with the regime. The regime will never give them the Kurds their legitimate rights.
الكرد في سوريا يعني كل الفصائل الكردية متفقة بشكل واضح في حفاظها وفي مطالبها على وحدة الأراضي السورية وعلى وحدة الشعب السوري. يعني هم في كل مناسبة يقولون نحن لا نطالب بالانفصال ولا نطالب بالاستقلال، نحن مصيرنا مرتبط مع مصير الشعب السوري ومع ثورة الشعب السوري. لهم تصورهم بأن سوريا المستقبلة يجب أن تكون دولة فيدرالية، أو أن الدولة الفيدرالية هي أفضل شكل حكم لسوريا المستقبلية، ولكن لا يوجد أي فصيل كردي وبما داخلهم البيدة حزب الاتحاد الديمقراطي، يعني بعكس ما يمكن أن يروج له أحيانا في وسائل إعلامية. في برنامج حزب الاتحاد الديمقراطي هو لا يطالب نهائيا بالانفصال، وإنما كما قلت يطالب بالفيدرالية، والمجلس الوطني الكردي أيضا أحزاب المجلس الوطني الكردي أيضا تطالب بنظام فيدرالي. إذن هم يؤكدون على هويتهم السورية وعلى انتمائهم السوري وعلى ضرورة تغيير هذا النظام الموجود الذي لم يؤمن ولم يعطيهم في أي لحظة من اللحظات حقوقهم المشروعة.
So Kurds in Syria, all Kurdish groups in Syria are in agreement, and they always stress their demands together, and that they emphasize Syrian unity, both in its territory and its people. No calls for separation or independence. They see their fate as tied to the fate of the rest of Syrians. There have been calls for federalism, with some viewing federalism as the best form of governance moving forward, but despite what some media reports say, that is internal, and Kurdish groups see themselves as part of Syria. They emphasize their Syrian identity. They emphasize the need for regime change because this regime has never given them their legitimate rights.
Thank you. I know you don't want to get into specific organizations, but I must ask you about one subject that appears in the press repeatedly. Obviously, the YPG is serving as the ground combat component of the coalition effort against Daesh in eastern Syria. There have been reports of, well, let's just say there have been conflicting reports about what has happened when Kurdish militia forces have routed Daesh from a populated Arab area. I think you know what I'm talking about. How do we get to the ground truth of these reports?
يعني أنا أعتقد أيضا أقول بأن وجود داعش في تلك المنطقة ومحاربتها في هذه الفترة للكرد كانت أيضا عملية مخطط لها، شبه مخطط لها، ولكن في النهاية يعني هل كانت هي مقصودة من البداية؟ كيف خطط لها؟ لحرف الكرد في معارك جانبية ولإشغالهم عن العملية الأساسية وهي الثورة ضد هذا النظام.
So on this issue, I believe ISIS's existence in those areas and their attacks on Kurds is a planned or semi-planned operation to deviate and distract Kurds and engage them in side battles and distract them from the revolution against the regime.
نحن نعرف أن قيادات داعش كانت موجودة في سجون النظام وأن النظام أطلق سراحهم قليلا بعد انطلاق الثورة، ونحن نعرف أيضا بأن داعش نحن ككرد سندت من قبل تركيا. هل هي السلطات الرئيسية التركية؟ هل هي الحكومة التركية الرسمية أم أنها قوى داخلية؟ هل هي كما يقولون في أتراك الدولة العميقة في تركيا وبعض الجروب الجيتم وغيرها هم من دعموا داعش؟ لا نعرف، ولكن هي حقيقة أساسية بأنه العديد من كاميونات والسيارات الكبيرة المعبأة بالسلاح دخلت من تركيا إلى المناطق الكردية لداعش، والمعونات دخلت من المناطق التركية من الحدود التركية إلى داعش. إذن نحن نعتقد بأن تركيا أرادت دعم داعش لاستنزاف القوة الكردية في معارك مع داعش، معارك جانبية، والنظام أيضا استفاد جدا بأنه أدخل الأكراد في معارك جانبية مع داعش بحيث أنهم هم لا ينضموا إلى الثورة السورية. فإذا نحن فرض علينا في هذه المناطق أن نحارب قوة إرهابية بربرية عنصرية راديكالية وحشية، وهذا كان جانب الدفاع عن النفس بالنسبة للأكراد وعن القيم يعني التي نتقاسمها نحن مع كل الإنسانيين. فرضت علينا هذه المعركة رغم إرادتنا، ولكننا نحن فخورون جدا بخوضها وبمحاربة هؤلاء الوحوش يعني.
Okay. So we know ISIS leadership was detained by the regime, and they were released soon after the start of the revolution by the regime. We also believe that ISIS is being supported by Turkey, whether that's support from the official leadership, forces from within Turkey, or a deep ISIS presence inside Turkey is not clear, but we know there have been weapons deliveries, supplies through the Turkish border to ISIS. And so we believe Turkey has supported ISIS in order to exhaust Kurdish forces and deviate them and force them or impose on them these side battles. And the regime has, of course, benefited from this. So this fight has been imposed on us. We have been forced to fight a barbaric radical terrorist organization, but we're proud to be fighting this battle against monsters for us, for Kurds, but also for the values we share with all of humanity.
يعني قوات وحدات حماية الشعب الكردية، أنتم العالم جميعا رأى هذه الشابات والشبان الإخوان الذين يعني ببطولة رائعة استماتوا في النضال ضد القوات داعش بأسلحتها الكبيرة جدا، والقوات الحماية الكردية لم تكن مسلحة بهذا الشكل. بعدها نشئت قوات سوريا الديمقراطية، بحيث أن المكون العربي والمكون المسيحي والآشوري والمختلف المكونات الموجودة في الجزيرة ساندت في وحدات حماية الشعب. وأنا أعتقد أن هذه الخطوة كانت خطوة إيجابية جدا. إذن يجب في هذه المعركة الموجودة في مناطق الجزيرة وفي مناطق الكردية ضد داعش أن لا تكون فقط، وهي ليست فقط عمل الكرد، يعني ليسوا الأكراد نفسهم وحدهم المعنيون في النضال ضد داعش. داعش قتلت الكثير من الجيش الحر ومن فئات المعارضة السورية المعتدلة والغير يعني قتلت داعش من القوات الجيش الحر والفئات أو الجماعات المعتدلة السورية أكثر مما قتل منهم النظام. إذن هي ليست فقط عملية أو نضال كردي مستقل، ولو أن داعش هي الآن تستهدف المناطق الكردية بشكل خاص، ولكن هي في نهاية الأمر معركة لكل السوريين ولكل الديمقراطيين ضد هذه القوى الظلامية.
So we've seen young women and men fight on the front lines of the PYD who died in the fight against ISIS. And after that, we saw the formation of the Syrian Democratic Forces that included Arab, Assyrian, and other components, which I believe was a very positive step. So, so of course, this is not to say that this is a Kurdish-only effort. We're all concerned with the fight against ISIS. ISIS has killed many from the Free Syrian Army, many from the opposition and moderate forces, even more so than the number of Free Syrian Army affiliates that were killed by the regime. So ISIS is not simply targeting Kurds. The battle against ISIS is a battle for all Syrians.
Thank you very much. Well, the good news is that my very bad Charlie Rose impersonation is now over. It's over to you. We have microphones going around. If you have a question, I'll call on you. Please take the microphone, stand up, state your name, affiliation, and make the question as brief as possible. This gentleman in the middle over here.
Thank you. I'm Rafi Danziger, an advisor to AIPAC, and I have if I may, two very quick questions. So Dr. Kodmani, we know, of course, that Hezbollah is working to support the regime. But can you tell us a bit more about how Hezbollah is conducting itself in the field? How is it treating the Syrian civilian population? And to Ms. Mofrej, you were a detainee yourself. Can you talk about what it was like to be a detainee, how long you spent there, some of your experiences there? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hezbollah is how do you say, the armed force for a policy that is defined by the regime, or that the practice that the regime has always had vis-à-vis the population, its own citizenry, is now taken on by Hezbollah. The approach that Hezbollah takes is one of spreading fear among civilians, and that has brought, Alice has talked about the detention centers that Hezbollah controls. When Hezbollah moves into one area, the civilian population, there is panic among civilians. There is very harsh treatment by Hezbollah. Nevertheless, I think what Hezbollah has tried to avoid is to be involved in direct massacres itself. That I have no specific information, but the battles that Hezbollah wages are usually to achieve military goals, not so much to come into direct contact with the civilian population. It sometimes makes it possible for regime forces to move into a certain area, and that's when massacres are committed. But if I were to take a comparison, I would say, if you remember in 1982, when Israeli troops moved into Lebanon and surrounded refugee camps, it wasn't Israel who committed the massacres inside the camps. Nevertheless, it was Israel who made them possible. And that's more the pattern that we have seen, I think, in Syria, as far as Hezbollah is concerned.
للأسف سأبني على ما تحدثت به الدكتورة بسمة. نحن السوريين دائما أمام خيارات السيء والأسوأ. المجتمع الدولي الآن يخيرنا بين داعش وبين الأسد. السوريون المعرضون للاعتقال إما مقرات النظام الأمني الرسمي أو اللجان الشعبية ومقرات حزب الله، وكلاهما سيء. الداخل موجود ومفقود بنفس الوقت. تجربتي هي الأقل سوء، ولكن أنا كنت من الناجين الذين استطعت أن أصل للمحافل الدولية، أن أتحدث بمشاهدات حية عندما كنت عين الشاهد في المعتقلات عما يحدث في السجون.
Unfortunately, I will build on what Ms. Basma Kudmani just said. We Syrians are offered choices between worse and worst. We're given the choice between either ISIS or the regime. And when it comes to detainees, we have the choice of either former detention facilities run by the regime or those run by militias and popular committees. So I'm a survivor of detention, and I believe my experience in detention is not as bad as other experiences of Syrians in detention. I was able to reach international fora.
في بداية الثورة السورية عندما كان النظام يقوم بالاعتقال من ساحات التظاهر، بال2011 تعرضت للضرب المبرح من اللجان الشعبية، كما كان يسميها النظام بالعصابات المسلحة التي كانت توزع حبوب الهلوسة على المتظاهرين، هكذا كما كان يروج. الضرب المبرح بالعصا الكهربائية، التعرض للتحرش الجسدي للنساء من أجل منعهن من أجل المشاركة في التظاهرات السلمية. طبعا التجربة كانت قاسية في الشارع، ولكن في الداخل 12 يوم ما كانوا كتار. لكن المشكلة الأسوأ أن بعد ازدياد حالة التصعيدات الفوضية الأمنية والقمعية في السجون، الحقيقة كانت التجربة الثانية هي مشاهدة صعبة وتجربة كانت مريرة بما شاهدت وليس بما عانيت.
So with the beginning of the revolution in 2011, I was beaten by members of popular committees, subject to sexual harassment. So there was harsh treatment on the street. And in my first detention, I was detained for 12 days, but inside the treatment wasn't as harsh. But of course, with more oppressive and security measures, what I witnessed in my second detention, not what I experienced, was absolutely horrific.
باختصار تعرضنا للتجويع المنهك، للأمراض المعدية بما يسمى الجرب الذي أنهك أجسادنا. كنا نفقد عقولنا من سماع صراخ تعذيب المعتقلين. كنت عين الشاهد بموت طفل عمره 12 سنة، هو كان رهينة عن والده، عاريا في يعني وسط الشتاء القارس، لا يوجد بطانيات، وإذا كان هناك بطانيات فهي يعني يغزوها القمل، والقمل كان كارثة. لا حمام، عدم التواصل مع المحاميين، الأماكن مزدحمة، كنا ننام بالتناوب. مسألة الضرب والتعذيب للأسف كان يستخدمها، وصل لحد أن طبيبة كانت معتقلة معي قام بتعليقها من شعرها. يعني هذا أقل ما شاهدته. أيضا حبست بالمنفردة وشاهدت جثث مجهولة الهوية تعرضت للتعذيب، هذا كان كفيل بفقدان العقل. لكن أنا متوازنة من أجل هذه القضية، لأن هناك أكثر من 200 ألف ينتظرون منا كسوريين وكمجتمع دولي أن نضع هذا المجتمع أمام استحقاقاته، لأن كل يوم يمر لدينا ضحايا يموتون تحت التعذيب في المعتقلات الأسدية.
And so in detention, we were starved. There were diseases amongst the detainees. We'd hear the screams of those being tortured and abused. I myself saw a 12-year-old die inside one of the detention facilities. He was naked in the cold. There were no blankets, no access to lawyers. The cells were very crowded. We'd have to take shifts in order to sleep. Constant beatings and torture. A doctor who was detained, a female doctor who was detained with me, was hung from her hair. And I also was placed in solitary confinement amongst dead bodies. That in and of itself was enough for me to lose my mind. But I'm still working on this issue because we have more than 200,000 detainees waiting for Syrians, waiting for the international community to help them.
Thank you. Yes. We have two side by side here.
أولاً شكراً لكل من ساهم في هذه الندوة الجميلة. عندي سؤالين للسيدة بسمة. السؤال الأول: حزب الاتحاد الديمقراطي الكردي وقوات سوريا الديمقراطية قوتين أساسيتين على الساحة السورية. أليست الهيئة العليا للمفاوضات
سؤال صعب.
أليست الهيئة العليا للمفاوضات مقصرة في المبادرة لفتح حوار سياسي وأمني معهما ولضم ممثلين عنهما إلى الهيئة العليا للمفاوضات؟ سؤال ثاني: لاحظنا تقدم نسبي في موضوع إيصال المساعدات للمناطق المحاصرة أو لبعض المناطق المحاصرة، وتقدم نسبي في الهدنة وخاصة في الشهرين الأولين. أما في موضوع المعتقلين فللأسف لم نلحظ تقدم واضح.
Okay. Let's go with what we've got. Thank you, sir. Basma. Oh, please, if you could interpret.
So firstly, thank you for all who've contributed to organizing this great discussion. I have two questions for Ms. Basma. First, the YPG and the Syrian Democratic Forces are two main forces on the ground in Syria. Isn't the HNC slacking in starting a conversation on political and security matters with these two groups and include representatives of these groups in the HNC? The second question, we've noticed relative progress on humanitarian aid delivery to some besieged areas, and with regards to the truce in the first 2 months of the cessation of hostilities. On detainees, unfortunately, we haven't seen no clear progress.
Thank you. I'll be brief because of time. I believe the forces, the PYD is indeed a force on the ground. It is important. The problem has been what has delayed their representation, I think, has been an ambiguity about their commitment to the integrity and the unity of Syria. That, from my personal perspective, seems clearer today than it was when the HNC was established. From the HNC perspective, there was a need to know also where these forces stood in terms of their affiliation. Are they in one camp or the other? Are they in a third camp somewhere else? Are they against the regime, clearly? Some of these groups were fighting alongside the regime in certain areas. I also believe today things are clearer, and the PYD is coming more clearly on the side of the opposition. And thirdly, as you know, there are regional players who have their own concerns about the Syrian situation and about the players represented in the opposition. And that also has had to be taken into account. And I believe there is also there a consideration of, if these are part of the opposition, then what guarantees are the regional players asking for? That's the first point. The second, very simply and briefly, the humanitarian issue saw some progress thanks to the establishment of a task force on humanitarian issues. It appeared as a mechanism that has some effectiveness and promised to deliver. But in fact, it delivered very little over the first month and a half, and then there was very serious regression. I believe because the humanitarian issue is used by the regime as a weapon it's a central weapon in its strategy. So we are not seeing the progress that we can see, and it will not be sustained, and it hasn't been sustained because not one siege has been lifted and no continuous sustained delivery to any area is secured. So we continue to negotiate 5 convoys, 6 trucks to this or that neighborhood, and a few weeks later, we're back to square one with the needs within these areas. So it looks like a Sisyphus task to negotiate for the humanitarian issue. And that task force is now showing its limitations.
And I would add, even at the task force level, the Russians have been sufficiently scandalized by regime behavior to post officers at checkpoints, actually to make sure that regime units do not loot the contents of UN convoys trying to pass through. Yes.
Hi, my name is Shabna Mujtahedi. I'm with the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. We've been involved in the negotiations, of course, on the civil society end of things, but it was quite curious to us moving, from the detainees issue and then jumping to something like the constitutional principles, which seemed like a strange transition. I was just wondering what was the process for setting the agenda, and how were you involved in setting the agenda for the negotiations? And if and when the negotiations continue, how would you like to see the structure change, if at all?
I think that's yours.
Yeah, I think we evolved a lot since the beginning of the Geneva process, and I personally welcome that because we went to Geneva based on the Geneva document, on Resolution 2254, on the guarantee that the negotiation would address the issue of political transition and a transitional governing body. The opposition was constantly saying, we will not talk about anything else but the transitional governing body. But we were brought to make that shape of the transitional governing body more explicit, to operationalize our own position, and to present working documents, discussion papers, in which we had a much more detailed approach to what we saw. And through that, I think, it opens the needed flexibility for the opposition to engage. The problem is, engaging with the UN is fine, but where does the UN take this? To whom? And that partner on the other side, unfortunately, continues to be missing. The regime never submitted any document, doesn't want to engage in any technical discussions, which the UN has suggested, because it simply doesn't trust anyone from its own camp to send to these discussions who would engage. So what we're seeing in Geneva, and that's why we like Geneva, because it simply exposes the difference between us and where the regime and how it is engaging.
Thank you. We're running low on time, sir. Briefly as possible.
As briefly as possible. Thank you, Alexander Kravitz. I'm a former diplomat. I would describe myself as at best a casual observer about Syria. And so I came here to learn, and I found 3 admirable women. My question, if we could fast forward, let's say, 10 years, I mean, you know, the horrific things that are happening in Syria, right? Can you somehow envision a Syria reunited, or, you know, some kind of a Syria 10 years from now, after everything that has happened, that is happening, and that unfortunately will, you know, probably continue to happen?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we ask Elise?
Elise.
سؤال مثير للاهتمام. حقيقة لما بنفكر أنه سوريا ستكون موحدة، أعتقد بأن اجتماع المعارضة من أقصى اليمين إلى أقصى اليسار بقواها المدنية والسياسية والعسكرية ضمن جسد الهيئة العليا للمفاوضات هو الخطوة الأولى باتجاه توحيد السوريين حول القضية الأساسية التي هي تمخضت عن المشروع الديمقراطي قبل أن تتحول إلى أجندات دولية وإقليمية، حيث تحولت سوريا فيها إلى ساحة لتصفية هذه النزاعات ضمن لعبة المصالح.
Very interesting question. I think when we think about our united Syria in the future, the ability of the opposition to unite people from the far left to the far right, from civil and military components, is a first step towards dealing with the main issue, which is democratic change as a united front. Unfortunately, what has become the case is that Syria is now a field for settling disputes in regional and international interests.
طبعا هذا لا يكفي، لدينا عدة آليات نحن عندما وضعنا وثائق خارطة الطريق السياسية التي تتحدث عن سوريا ووحدة مصير الأراضي والشعب السوري. تحدثنا عن المواطنة المتساوية، تحدثنا عن العدالة الانتقالية والمساءلة والمحاسبة التي تضمن السلام المستدام. أيضا وضعنا في الآليات التي عملنا عليها مسألة هيكلة الجيش السوري. هذا هو صمام أي سلام مستدام في سوريا، بمعنى لا يمكن أن يكون الجيش السوري على شاكلته الحالية أن يتحول لجيش وطني لمحاربة الإرهاب بعد هيكلته توحيد سلاح المعارضة مع هذا الجيش من أجل محاربة التطرف والإرهاب في سوريا. الحفاظ على مؤسسات الدولة كشرط أساس أيضا، لأننا نحن لا نريد إلغاء، نحن نريد الاستمرار والبناء على ما يمكن البناء عليه كوننا أصحاب مشروع تغيير ديمقراطي. هذا كفيل، ولكن هذا الدم السوري الذي يسمونه بالدم الثقيل يحتاج على ما أظن لسنوات في حال تم الاتفاق الدولي على حل سياسي، وللأسف مصير السوريين أصبح رهن هذا الاتفاق.
But of course, this is not enough, and we've developed several mechanisms and a roadmap for moving forward. We've emphasized equal citizenship, the need for accountability, as I said before, a transitional justice track, and a very key issue is restructuring the Syrian military for a sustainable peace in the future. So this restructuring would also involve the Syrian army becoming a national army and uniting the arms of the opposition with that of the Syrian military to fight terrorism and radicalism in Syria. In addition, there's the issue of continuity of state institutions. We emphasize the need for maintaining state institutions and building on state institutions. This, of course, will need years after a political solution is decided on.
Thank you. You wanted to add something?
One sentence to say, and we are working on decentralization in order to address the demands of all communities. Seva and I have been working on this issue together. The Kurds are involved in this discussion. It's a very important one for them, but for all Syrians. But we need a central state, and that is very important. We need an effective, strong central state. If we don't have that, we cannot talk about any form of decentralization. And even if we were to discuss federalism in the future, The important thing is how do we connect all these regions of Syria to the central state? If the answer is not clear to that point, we are talking about de facto partition. And that has failed in Yemen, has failed in Iraq, and we should draw the lessons from that. That discussion is ongoing.
We are objectively out of time. We'll take one more question from the audience. It's yours, Mohammed. I will try to prevail on the panel to stick around for 10 minutes or so. For those of you who have individual questions, you're welcome to come forward and pose them, please.
Thank you, Fred. First of all, I'd like to thank the discussants today. You've done a marvelous job. We're really proud of you and proud of Syrian women. My name is Mohammed Ghanem. I am with the Syrian American Council. I have a quick question for Dr. Izuli. So the YPG/PYD is a Kurdish faction, but it's one Kurdish faction. There are other Kurdish factions in Syria. The YPG doesn't seem to see eye to eye with other Syrian Kurdish factions. Given that the United States works with the YPG and supports them and has leverage over them, how do you think the U.S. can encourage more democratic practices on the part of the YPG so they wouldn't harass civil society activists or crack down on dissent? And then with regard to the point about federalism, if the rest of the country is not on board with federalism, so how would that conflict play itself out? How would you reconcile both visions? If the rest of the country, let's say, would like decentralized state with some devolution of decision making but not federalism? Thank you.
Thank you.
بالتأكيد يعني ما يزعجنا يعني أنا كشخص رغم أنه نجد على الساحة الكردية حاليا الحزب الاتحاد الديمقراطي الPYD يتقدم بشكل كبير وهو له استراتيجية معينة وله إيديولوجية وله برنامج ويحقق نجاحات رائعة على الساحة في البناء يعني ليس فقط في الحرب ضد داعش وإنما في خطوات البناء خلف المحاربة يعني من داعش واستقطاب كافة المكونات الموجودة كلها خطوات رائعة يتقدم بها ولكن ما ينتقد به حزب البيادي هو أنه لم يستوعب إلى الآن أن ثورة الشعب السوري كانت ثورة ضد استبداد حزب واحد وضد الشخص القائد الواحد. إذا نحن التعددية هي أساس الديمقراطية والتعددية هي أساس التقدم وحذف المعارض السياسي هو اللاديمقراطية وهو التأخر الفكري السياسي وبالتأكيد حزب الاتحاد الديمقراطي رغم الخطوات الرائعة التي يقوم بها إلا أن له تصرفات استبدادية وهو قام بطرد العديد من المعارضين الكرد السياسيين من الأحزاب الأخرى ونفيهم أنتم بأي حق وبأي سلطة تستطيعون أن تنفوا كردي من المناطق الكردية إذن يجب هم أن يستوعبوا بأن نجاحاتهم الرائعة والباهرة التي نصفق لها لا تكفي لأن نصمت عن التصرفات الاستبدادية الأخرى وبأنهم لا بد من مقاومة ونحن نأمل بالتأكيد من الأمريكيين الذين يساعدون البيدة ولهم الحق وهم محقين في مساعدتهم في مواجهة داعش ولكن يجب أيضا الضغط عليهم بشكل أو بآخر لكي يكونوا أكثر انفتاحا لأن انفتاحهم هو نصرهم وهو تكبير لهم وليس تصغير لهم.
Of course, we see the PYD making advances on the ground, not only against ISIS, but also rebuilding in areas after evicting ISIS. But the problem is that it hasn't understood that oppression is not okay. So we see pluralism as a basis for progress and democracy, and I'm talking about myself personally. So despite some of their advances and some of their victories that we applaud, we cannot accept or we cannot be silent on some of the oppression or oppressive behaviors that they've shown. For example, evicting some Kurdish groups from a Kurdish area. How can you do that? We hope that the U.S. that is supporting the PYD can act to pressure the PYD to be more open, because with more openness comes victory, and that won't undermine the PYD.
Thank you very much. I think we've seen a good example this afternoon of why the leadership of women is so important to the Syrian revolution and why it needs to become even more important. Please join me in thanking our excellent panelists.